A man with nothing left doesn't give away his final lifeline. That's what logic dictated. That's what survival demanded. But when Matthias Cole led that mule from his barn at twilight, sweat staining his threadbare shirt and desperation etched into every line of his face, he didn't look like a man making a calculated decision. He looked like someone who'd already surrendered to fate. The two Shoshone sisters standing at his property's edge had no business being there. The younger one sagged against the elder, crimson spreading through the cloth wrapped around her shoulder. They didn't speak, didn't plead, just watched him with eyes that expected rejection, as if disappointment was the only currency they'd ever known. Matthias had endured 4 months alone on that dying Colorado homestead. 4 months since grasshoppers devoured his wheat. 4 months since he'd heard another human voice. In all that time, the one thing he'd protected, the one asset he'd preserved, was that mule, his final piece of value, his sole escape route. But something about the silence between those sisters shattered something inside him, or perhaps mended something broken far longer. He gave them the mule. No words, no conditions, just loosened the lead rope and extended it toward them. Before we dive into what happened next, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support from every corner of the globe is what keeps these stories coming. The elder sister stared at him like he'd offered poison. The younger one's eyes widened with confusion mixed with distrust. This violated every rule they'd learned. White settlers didn't do things like this. Not for people like them. But Matthias simply gestured toward the mountains where daylight was dying, then stepped back into shadow. They took the mule and vanished into gathering darkness. What Matthias couldn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that someone had been watching from the ridge above, someone who'd witnessed everything, someone who would carry that image back to an encampment where 300 warriors awaited word. And when dawn broke the next morning, the horizon transformed. It filled with shapes, dozens, then scores, then hundreds, moving as one unified force, coming straight toward the homestead. Matthias stood in his doorway, watching them approach, and understood he'd made a choice with permanent consequences. Whatever came next was already set in motion. The question wasn't whether they'd reach him. The question was why they were coming, and what they intended when they arrived. Matthias didn't retreat from the doorway. His hands hung loose at his sides, fingers trembling despite his attempts at control. The Winchester leaned against the frame behind him, within reach but untouched. He'd known this moment would manifest. Some instinct had whispered it the instant he'd released those reins. The shapes on the horizon solidified into riders, too many to count accurately. They moved in disciplined formation, purposeful and relentless. The sound reached him before individual faces became visible. Thunder of hooves against hard-pan earth, rhythmic and inexorable. His throat constricted. 4 months of isolation, and now this. He considered running, but where would he go? The homestead stretched behind him, collapsed fencing and scorched earth. The barn where the mule had sheltered stood empty, its door hanging askew on corroded hinges. He'd surrendered his only transportation. The riders slowed as they reached his property's perimeter. The formation shifted, spreading wider, encircling everything. Matthias counted 20, then 40, then stopped counting. They surrounded his land with military precision, not chaotic raiders, but something organized, intentional. One rider separated from the formation advancing ahead of the others. The figure sat tall, wrapped in leather and woven fabric that caught wind. Behind them, the mass of warriors held position, waiting. Matthias forced himself to breathe steadily. His father's voice echoed from memory. "Panic kills, boy. Stay present." The lone rider approached the fence line and stopped. For several heartbeats, nothing moved. The warrior remained mounted, perfectly still. Then slowly, deliberately, they dismounted. Every instinct screamed at Matthias to grab the Winchester. Instead, he stepped into the open where he could be seen clearly. If this was the end, he'd meet it standing. The warrior walked forward, crossing into his yard. Sunlight caught her face, and Matthias's breath stuttered. It was the elder sister, Aita. She moved differently now. The exhaustion that had weighed her down had vanished, replaced by authority earned through years of survival. She walked like someone who belonged exactly where she stood. But her eyes stopped him cold. They held no gratitude, no softness. They were measuring him, calculating, weighing something he couldn't identify. She halted 15 feet away, close enough to communicate, distant enough to maintain caution. Matthias waited, throat dry as alkali dust. Aita didn't smile, didn't thank him, just stood there, studying him with intensity that raised every hair on his neck. Behind her, hundreds of warriors remained motionless, watching. Finally, she spoke, voice carrying across the space between them. "He wants to see you." Not a request. A declaration. Matthias swallowed hard. "Who?" Aita's expression remained impassive. "The one whose daughter you helped is named Takoda. You gave away something without his permission. Now he'll decide what that means." The words landed like stones in his chest. Behind Aita, the formation parted. A single rider emerged from the center, advancing with deliberate slowness. Even from distance, Matthias felt authority radiating from him like heat from forged metal. Aita turned slightly, gesturing toward the approaching rider. "That's Takoda, and you're about to learn what happens when you interfere with his family." Takoda moved like inevitability itself, smooth, patient, unstoppable. His horse stepped carefully, each hoof strike measured and purposeful. As he drew closer, details emerged that quickened Matthias's pulse. The man was older than expected, silver threading through black hair that fell past his shoulders. Scars marked his forearms, visible even from distance, but his face commanded attention, weathered, hard, completely unreadable. Matthias forced himself upright, locking his knees against weakness. Running was impossible. Begging was pointless. Whatever judgment approached, he'd face it standing. Takoda stopped 20 feet away and dismounted in one fluid motion, landing soundlessly. For long seconds, he simply observed Matthias, not with anger or curiosity, but with assessment, like examining an object whose purpose remained unclear. Matthias's mouth felt full of sand. He wanted to speak, to explain, but words lodged in his throat. What could he possibly say? That he'd felt compassion? That he couldn't watch suffering and do nothing? That something inside him fractured at the sight of that wounded girl? None of it would matter to a father who'd just learned a stranger had touched his family's fate. Takoda advanced, each step deliberate. He stopped within arm's reach, close enough that Matthias could see deep lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the perfectly controlled breathing. Up close, the man was even more imposing, taller by several inches, broader through the shoulders. Everything about him spoke of strength forged through decades of necessity. "You gave them the mule." Takoda's voice was low, graveled, but clear. English spoken with careful precision. Matthias nodded, voice rough when it emerged. "Yes." "Why?" The question landed like challenge. Matthias felt the weight of 300 warriors watching from behind Takoda. One wrong word, one perceived insult, and this ended badly. But lying felt worse than dying. They needed it more than I did. Takoda's eyes narrowed. "You knew who they were." "No, you knew what giving away your last animal meant." Matthias's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And you did it anyway." It wasn't a question. Matthias remained silent. Takoda moved closer, so close Matthias could see faint tremor in the older man's hands. Not from fear or weakness, but from something restrained, something held under tight control. "My daughter told me what you did. Shoshone, the younger one. She would have died without that mule. They were being hunted. 4 men tracking them since sunrise. If they'd been caught on foot—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Matthias felt something shift in his chest. "Is she all right?" Takoda's expression flickered, just briefly, something like surprise crossing his features before the mask returned. "She's alive because of you." The words should have brought relief. Instead, they hung suspended, incomplete. Takoda turned slightly, glancing back toward the warriors. Then he looked at Matthias again, and this time something different entered his gaze, something that made Matthias's stomach drop. 4 men were tracking my daughters. They were found this morning, half a day's ride from here. He paused. They'd been asking about a homesteader, white man living alone. They wanted to know if he'd seen 2 Shoshone women. The implication struck like fist to solar plexus. Those men had been headed here, looking for the sisters. If Matthias had kept the mule, sent the women away on foot, they'd have been captured, and he'd have been questioned, or worse. "You didn't just save my daughters," Takoda said quietly. "You made yourself a target." Behind him, the warriors shifted, not threateningly, but with anticipation. Takoda stepped back, creating space. His hand moved to his side, and Matthias's entire body went rigid. But Takoda didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he reached into the pouch at his belt and extracted something, a strip of braided leather, worn and marked with symbols Matthias didn't recognize. Takoda held it forward. "You'll need to come with us." Matthias stared at the offered item, mind racing. "Come with you where?" Takoda's expression remained unchanged. "Those men had companions. More are coming. They know you helped my daughters. If you stay here, you won't survive 3 days." The weight of that statement settled over Matthias like frost. "And if I go with you?" His voice barely rose above whisper. Takoda's eyes locked onto his. "Then you live long enough to understand what you've done."